your job because you're on porn sites all day long at work, well, that's a big deal, right? There's a problem there. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface in understanding some of these things. But I would almost guarantee you that it's all the same pathways in the brain that's involved. The other thing that's interesting about that is, have you guys known anybody, ever known anybody that had like one addiction and then they quit? They were able to get treatment and they were able to give up that addiction only to kind of fall down into another addiction, right? How common is that? Well, think about it, right? The brain is still wired. It's still not wired like it should be. So yeah, you gave up alcohol, but you went right over to benzodiazepines. So your Valium, now you're addicted to Valium instead of the alcohol. I mean, I'm not sure one's any better than the other. It's still an addiction, right? But, you know, but I remember having a lot of folks that would treat that would say that, hey, doc, I haven't drank in 15 years. Well, that's great. Well, I've been taking Valium, 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams a day for 15 years too. Well, unfortunately, I think you just basically substituted one addiction for another. But, you know, hey, so I think you got to keep in mind that the cross addiction, I'm sorry, that's not the right. Pat, help me out. What's that called? Is it cross addiction? Cross addiction. What's it called where you get substituted cross addiction? I think it is. I think it's what it's called. Anyway, put you on the spot, didn't I? Okay, so now. The next thing I want to do was spend some time talking about the different kind of classes of drugs of abuse. You know, what do they do in the brain and what the symptoms are and all that. But before I do that, do you guys have any questions about all the stuff I just talked about? Is there any questions about the brain and how it's wired and all that? Does it make sense? Or did I just kind of lose everybody? Everybody's nodding their heads. Okay, it makes sense. Good, good. I'm glad. You guys... I'm going to present this stuff pretty simplistically because that's the way I think. I'm kind of simple, not the sharpest tool in the shed. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, on the dopamine, if you could get too much, you said it was difficult that to just not be able to correct the amount of dopamine. Is there treatments that they attempt to do that, or is that just not possible?
No, there are some treatments that they try to use, like for instance the Wellbutrin issue. That's a drug that boosts two chemicals in the brain, but dopamine is one of them. And the idea there is that if you can do that with a medicine that's non-addictive, you know, then maybe that will substitute somehow, or maybe like for smoking, the idea is that they won't crave the cigarettes as much. You know, that and that's what happens. I mean, they don't, you know, even if they continue to smoke, they usually smoke a little less.
So is that the only thing that they use dopamine for? Is like the Wellbutrin for smoking? I mean, with other addictions or other...
As far as I know, there is not, there's probably research I'm sure going on. I'm not up to date on all of that and all the different places around the world that are doing research, but there are, but as far as I know, of anything that's approved right now for use in addictions, this, for the Wellbutrin is the only one that I know of that works on dopamine. The rest of them have another sort of a unique, different way of acting, like Revia is one for alcohol use, and I think maybe, I'm not sure if it's indicated, but it can also be used for opiates and things. And these folks don't crave, they don't crave the opiates or the alcohol as much. And when they've done studies showing that with Revia, folks, when they do relapse on alcohol, they don't drink as heavy as they did before. And there might be some benefit to that, but you know, ideally we'd like to use something that where they wouldn't need. You know, we don't want to get them addicted to something else. That's the other issue. I think that's the other problem is, you know, some of these things you might stimulate dopamine, but you know, then they get addicted to whatever it is you're giving them. So it's kind of hard to do. You know, it's hard. It's a normal part of the brain, and it's just not working right. So you can't take it completely away, or then these folks, you know, if you block the reward center completely, then they wouldn't want to eat. They wouldn't want to do things that are human. You know, or so.
So if it's a damage to the brain in some manner, has there been enough studies? I'm sure there have been studies that go back to babies that have been preemies or different issues during delivery and whatever.
I don't want you to think of it as I mean, we don't know for sure to answer that question. Like, I don't.
It's not the perfect balance, I'm saying.
Yeah, and it's not. You remember what I said about the monkeys now? These are folks. I mean, the brain is constantly changing. Okay, so in response to its environment. So remember the monkey study, right? These were monkeys that they didn't have any brain damage that we know of. I mean, their births were normal and all that. They didn't have any brain damage, but it was the environment that sort of caused the brain to downregulate or something to happen. It wasn't permanent.
Balance is probably a better word, right? That's,
Yeah, I mean, I think...
That perfect balance, it sounds like, we're in the perfect world and the perfect
yeah,
person.
I don't know what perfect is, but yeah, I don't know what perfect is, but I guess the way I think about it is all of us are going to have some stress, so you can't completely take all the stress out of somebody's life. But if somebody has a lot of ongoing stress, we know that that's not good for the brain. And this is just one way, by the way. There's other parts, the stress response system in the brain, which we'll talk about, and actually maybe next time or the time after, we're going to talk a little bit about that and about some of the studies that have shown that early childhood trauma can set a person up for depression and anxiety in adult life because of the stress response system. And basically, the brain, as a child, your brain is molding itself to its environment as you're growing up. And if that environment's not so good, you're potentially permanently changing the way that brain develops, and then setting that person up at risk for different things as an adult. So this is just one, addictions. But depression, anxiety, incidentally, those things they run together. So folks with depression have a lot higher incidence of using drugs and alcohol. This might be why, right? Because maybe they had a similar sort of stress and trauma growing up, and it not only affected the reward center in these parts of the brain that we're talking about tonight, but also the stress response system in the brain. And so this is why maybe a lot of people that have addictions also have depression, anxiety, or vice versa. Folks that have depression and anxiety also have addictions. It's good questions. I think some of it we know something about, and some of it we don't. But good anyway. Anybody else? Okay, so I was talking about how I tend to think of the drugs of abuse. The different. We put them into classes, right? So, and one simple way to do it is, what are things that stimulate or excite the brain? Okay, and then what are things that sort of calm the brain or downers, so to speak, I guess, and uppers, I suppose. That's the easy way to put it. But let's talk, I guess, first about the stimulating things. Anybody know what stimulates the brain? I mentioned one or two already a lot. What kind of drugs stimulate the brain? You guys know? Drugs of abuse now, that you get on the streets. Cocaine, right? Cocaine's one. We talked about that. Huh? Methamphetamine, excellent. And different types of amphetamine. There's Ritalin and Dexedrine and things like that. Those are things that stimulate the brain. Ecstasy has some degree of stimulating effect, but also things like caffeine and ephedrine or pseudoephedrine. Ephedrine, was I think in many things, if I'm not mistaken, and then pseudoephedrine's in all the cold pills and things, and now that's been moved behind the counter. But those things are all sort of stimulating in the brain. Now, what does that do? I mean, what is that? When somebody takes something like that, think about for a second, what does it mean to excite the brain? Well, these folks get a lot of energy, and I think for a second too, if you guys have known folks that have taken too much caffeine or they've taken too much of some drug or something, and what do? They get euphoric, meaning that their mood is really good all the time. They don't need to sleep as much, right? They lose weight. In the old days, folks used to abuse Ritalin and Dexedrine and stuff for weight loss, and they'd get hooked on them sometimes for that. Maybe they still do, but I think it's less common. They sometimes, if you soup up the brain too much, you might hallucinate, like we talked last time about psychosis. These folks might get psychotic, hallucinate, or have delusions. Okay, they get kind of paranoid sometimes, hypervigilant, looking around all the time, what's going on, kind of thing. Their moods swing. They get wired and shaky, kind of thing, and of course their heart rate and their blood pressure go up. So these are drugs that excite the brain. So then they sort of those are all things the things I just described. That makes sense, right? Those are excitatory things or stimulating things. Now I want to talk about overdose for a second. What happens if you overdose on something like that? I once saw a 30-year-old woman in the emergency room at Methodist who was having a heart attack. And we thought, well, 30 years old, having a heart attack. She's female. What the heck? Cocaine. She had used so much cocaine, it souped up her blood pressure and heart rate so much, her heart couldn't keep up, and she was having a heart attack. First heart attack at 30 years old. So I'll never forget that. That sort of shocked me that was possible. And Sure enough, that's what can happen, and of course you can die. If you overdose and take too much, obviously you can basically have a heart attack and you die, okay? Or a rhythm problem of the heart, where the heart's beating so fast it just kind of goes out of control. Can't get the blood pumped like it should, and the person dies. So stimulants, and too much stimulant can kill you. Now withdrawal, on the other hand, it's usually not deadly, but I want you to think about, we just talked about what happens when you use a drug and what effect does it have on you. The withdrawal is always the opposite of that. That's pretty easy to remember. So if cocaine stimulates the brain, what do you suppose taking the cocaine away does? If you've been using cocaine for a long time and then you just sort of stop it, everything slows down, right? So these folks get depressed. Instead of euphoric, they're depressed. And they need lots of sleep. And they eat a lot. And they don't have any energy, okay? It's the opposite of what happens when you use the drug. And the way I think about that is, again, the brain has a way of adjusting to its environment. So if you're stimulating it over and over again, it finally says, gosh, I can't do this much longer. And it starts to put the brakes on a little bit for itself, okay? That's the way I think of it, kind of simple. It starts to put the brakes on a little bit. Now all of a sudden you take away the stimulant. Well, it takes a while for the brain to let off the brakes. They're still on. And then the person's, really slowed down. And really, so that's the withdrawal, okay? Now, question is usually not deadly, but I mean, it certainly is not comfortable, of course. It's the overdose with stimulants that's deadly. It can be deadly. Okay, questions about stimulants first. Then we'll go into the next group. No questions? All right. Now, what about the opposite? What about drugs that slow the brain activity down? Some folks use those things. So alcohol would be one of those, right? But also things like Valium. We call them benzodiazepines, but drugs like Valium. In the old days, they had a lot more that weren't necessarily benzodiazepines, but Milltown and it was one with a P, Placidil, I think. And of course, they took that off the market. Milltown, I think, is off the market nowadays. I remember just a few years back, I had somebody that was an older person that had been on Placidil for years, and all of a sudden I got this thing across my desk, hey, we're no longer making this. I thought, oh no, how am I going to get this? She's 80 years old, how am I getting her off Placidil? Anyways, these drugs are, we were able to do it. It wasn't as hard as I thought, but it always scares you a little bit. They take a drug off the market, you got somebody on it. I didn't have it, she'd been on it for years. And anyway, so these drugs all slow the brain activity. So what would that be? We just talked about that. So that it's like depression, but it also could be, like a calming effect. They don't have as much anxiety. Sedation, meaning sleepiness and all that. Their judgment isn't as good, so they may do things without really, without putting a lot of thought into it. Motor coordination is not very good. Speech is slurred. And so this is why you shouldn't drive when you're using these drugs, right? And really, incidentally, you shouldn't drive on stimulants either. Why? Because with stimulants, you're impulsive. You're jerking in and out of traffic, you're driving 90 miles an hour, let's go, come on, get out of my way, that kind of stuff. That's a stimulant. Well, the depressing drugs, kind of the opposite. It's like, I don't care if I get there today or tomorrow. It's just very slow, and of course the little child runs out in front of you. You can't get your foot off the accelerator onto that brake in time, and you hit somebody. This is why folks, when they drive drunk, unfortunately, people die, okay? Incidentally, any sedating medicine that you're on puts you at risk for that kind of stuff. So even if you're taking antihistamines or something that can make you sleepy, unless you really know how that's affecting you and you're pretty intolerant to it, you shouldn't be getting behind the wheel of a car. You hear about this all the time. Somebody usually it's some important person, so to speak, who ends up having an accident, and it turns out they're on opiates, or they're on some painkiller or something that slows the brain activity down, and they took it right before they went out and drove, and of course they had an accident. Hopefully, maybe somebody died or whatever. So you got to think about that stuff. If you don't know how it's going to affect you, and you're not really tolerant to it, you shouldn't be getting behind the wheel. But obviously, and the other thing I want to tell you about is, the front part of our brains, we talked about one part of it, but another part of the front of our brains gives us social graces. So it tells me, for instance, that there are certain things that I'm okay saying up here, certain things I shouldn't say up here, okay? So what happens when somebody starts drinking and gets drunk? Well, it slows or calms that part of the brain down. What do these folks do? They do stuff that they would never do when you're sober, right? Their social graces are gone, right? Because you suppressed them. with the alcohol. Same thing can happen with Valium and drugs like that, because it's the same thing. You're suppressing that brain activity. And so people act goofy and they do things that are, they wouldn't do otherwise. And, sometimes that's funny. We can laugh about it. Other times it's really scary, because you have somebody who's clinically depressed. Thoughts of, hey, I don't care if I live anymore. Now you add alcohol, and what used to be just a thought of I don't care if I live or not, now it's all of a sudden, I don't care if I live or not, and bam, they're gone. And it's that fast. And that is scary, okay? So this is why folks, one of the many reasons why folks who have depression should probably not drink. Folks that really have any kind of illness of the brain should not drink, should not use alcohol or drugs, okay? Because it's going to screw up the illness, first of all. Like, these things are, what did I just say one of the symptoms of this is? If you use a depressing drug in your brain, what does it do to your mood? It makes you depressed. If you're already depressed, you don't want to be more depressed, right? So, and I'm not saying to go use cocaine, okay, because that's not the answer either, right? It's a temporary thing, and you're going to get hooked on cocaine. So, when you're depressed, you seek treatment for the depression. You don't use alcohol, you don't use drugs of any kind to try to alter it, or, and I think, the common thing is alcohol, because it's so accepted in our society. So folks with anxiety disorders, what will they do? They'll go to a party, they're socially anxious, they go to a party and they start to drink. And that loosens them up and they're fine. Trouble is, what happens if their reward center is wired wrong? What happens if this other part of the brain is wired wrong? Now they have addiction. And it all started because they were socially phobic. If they just had gotten treatment for the social phobia and maybe some psychotherapy and some other things, they'd have been a little more comfortable around people, they wouldn't have maybe started drinking, and they wouldn't have had the addiction. So you see how this stuff is tied together? It's not so easy, It's not. I sort of talk about it. It's like it's easy, but it's not. And you have to keep in mind all of these things. Kind of got far afield here on that one. Overdose on drugs that are depressing or suppressing in the brain. What would overdose look like? It'd be more of that, right? It'd be too much of that, and so that can lead to death, right? If you suppressed your brain activity enough, then the parts of the brain that tell your lungs to breathe and tell your heart to beat, they may not work anymore. You may suppress them so much. Folks that have trouble breathing, for instance, if they take a drug that calms down their brain activity and they already have trouble breathing, that could take their life, right? They may not wake up. They may go to sleep and not wake up. So drugs that slow the brain activity can, especially when you overdose or in certain people, those type of drugs can lead to death and overdose. Withdrawal. What does the withdrawal look like? If the drug causes you to slow way down, what do you think the brain's going to want to do in response to that? Your brain's going to say, "Gosh, I just can't get going. I don't want to do this anymore," and it's going to sort of accelerate itself a little bit to try to counteract some of that slowness that's being caused by the drug. Well, that's all fine and dandy as long as you're using the drug, right? And then when you stop the drug, after you've been on the drug, usually it's, the people that are highest risk are folks that have been on the drug for a long time at a fairly high dose, and then they stop all of a sudden. Well, you guys know, what happens with somebody who's drinking, and stops? Is that safe? Not so much, right? These folks can die, right? They can go to DTs and die. DTs is, a fancy word, but basically what happens is the brain, it's sort of geared itself up. It's ratcheted things up a little bit to counteract that depressing effect of that drug. Then you take away the drug, and all of a sudden, the brain's it's haywire. It's going too fast. Everything's going too fast. So what do you see? You see anxiety. You see agitation. These folks can't sit still. You see their vital signs go through the roof, so their blood pressure and their pulse are going really fast. And again, that's not healthy. You can sometimes see them get psychotic and see things that aren't there, maybe feel stuff crawling on their skin. You can see confusion, shakiness, seizures. Seizures are from too much brain activity. The brain and then of course these things can be life-threatening, so these folks can die. So with depressing drugs, you take too much, you can die. And if you take a fairly good dose for a long time and then stop cold turkey, you can also die from that. So I want to make it clear, I guess, on some of these, which ones are potentially fatal and which ones are not. Incidentally, Valium and Xanax and these other drugs, we don't call it DTs necessarily, but it's really the same thing. It's the exact same thing would happen if you were taking that for a fairly high dose and for a while, and then you stopped it cold turkey. And the interesting thing is, depending on which one of those it is, like for instance Xanax, it kicks in real fast, but it comes out real fast of your system. So that's really that's one of the highest risk things for withdrawal, because if it comes out of your system really fast, that's when the brain has trouble with it. Something that's longer acting may not, you still may have issues, but it may not be right away, and it may be not as bad as something like a shorter acting pill like of the benzodiazepines, which like Xanax and Valium. Does that make sense? I don't know, I didn't lose you guys. Okay, another class of drugs that are sort of like, they also sort of calm the brain activity down. They're opiates, okay, narcotics. So these would be things like, what's in Vicodin, what's in oxycodone. That's the big one. Oxycontin is the one that everybody hears about, talks about today. In the old days, it used to be, morphine. It's still sometimes now. Methadone's another one. What else? Heroin is another one. In the old days, that was a biggie. These are painkillers, so these are usually prescribed, that some of them anyway are prescribed to kill pain, folks that have a lot of pain. And unfortunately, it's innocent enough. You hear about ball players that go in, they have some injury, they get on Vicodin, they get on something. They don't know how the brain's wired, do they? Neither does the doctor. The doctor's innocent enough. He says, you got some pain, I know you broke this or you tore that or whatever. Here's some Vicodin. Well, after a while it's not doing it. Here's some Oxycontin. Next thing you know, they're hooked. Right? And then it comes out in the papers, they failed drug screening, they're hooked, and this, that, and the other. What's his name? Rush Limbaugh, didn't he get into something like that? So, I mean, you don't know how you're wired, and you get exposed to this. I'm not saying never take a drug of addiction. That's not what I'm saying. So, if you have pain, I'm not saying don't ever take any kind of narcotic pain pill. But certainly, if you have a family history of somebody who had in your family who had trouble with alcohol or addiction of some kind, tell the doctor that, will you? Because then the doctor will say, oh, okay, well, maybe we'll need to kind of keep an eye on you. Here, I'll just give you this much. And, be honest with the doctor. If you ever had a history of addiction to alcohol or cocaine or something else, and then you have an injury and you have pain and you need some pain pills, you still need the pain pills, that's okay. But you got to tell the doctor, I had a history of addiction to this, this, or this. So he knows, or she knows, to watch out for that and kind of monitor you close, and, things don't get out of hand, okay? Another sort of digression here. These opiate drugs, what do? They kill pain, obviously, but they also are kind of calming. So they can be sedating. So you got to be careful, like I said, with driving and things like that. They can cause constipation because they slow down the bowels. They can decrease your memory, maybe some confusion, some slurred speech, maybe have a hard time paying attention. Your judgment may be off, and they can make the pupils really small, which is just kind of an interesting little thing. I don't know why I told you that, but just so you know, you see somebody with really teeny tiny pupils and it's a really bright day or a really dark room, fairly dark room, and you kind of wonder, what's going on. It may be not that, it may be something else. But now, what happens in overdose? Obviously, overdose of these things. What happens? We just talked about that with the other depressing drugs. You can suppress the respirations, the breathing. So these folks will sometimes, they can die basically from overdose of these drugs. So that's overdose. It's just everything gets worse, except that you could potentially die. The withdrawal, on the other hand, is sort of the opposite of all those symptoms I just mentioned. So instead of sedation, you're awake and you're jittery, you're shaky. Instead of constipation, you have diarrhea, maybe. You get a runny nose. You can have increased pain instead of decreased pain. Muscle aches, nausea, vomiting. Again, it has to do with the bowels. And the pupils can dilate, which obviously it's the opposite of what happens when so withdrawals is the opposite of the overdose or the actual effect of the drug. Now, interestingly enough, usually the withdrawal from this is not deadly. It doesn't feel very good, as you can imagine, having all these things. People feel quite miserable, but they usually won't die from it. So that's a good thing. Almost done here. I got hallucinogens. I'll just real quickly cover, like LSD is kind of the classic example of that. And these drugs make folks, like we talked last time about psychosis, hallucinations where you see things or hear things that aren't real necessarily, may not be real, and delusions where you think something's happening that isn't. Okay, that's a hallucinogen. That's things like LSD. Ecstasy has a little bit of properties like that, but also a little bit like a stimulant. These folks, they can sometimes have anxiety. A lot of times, they feel sort of unreal or detached from themselves. Sometimes paranoid. They get paranoid. They can get shaky, sweaty, have chills, mood changes, and impulsiveness. The overdose is usually, it's just a really intense psychosis. And these folks, unfortunately, sometimes these folks go on in their lives and have trouble with either really bad flashbacks or frank psychosis. I've seen cases, and I don't know, well, I've seen cases where a young person will use LSD and then have trouble with psychosis from then on. And without treatment, they continue to have psychotic episodes. What I don't know is, are those folks that would have already been at risk to have schizophrenia anyway, or something like that anyway, psychotic illness anyway? They might have been, and maybe the LSD threw them over. But like we've talked about, all of us can become psychotic. Well, maybe the LSD made that person get psychotic once, and we talked about with schizophrenia that once you've been psychotic, it's easier to get psychotic again. So maybe what we've done is that the person's threshold for being psychotic was here. They took LSD and it dropped, and then from then on they had trouble with psychosis. That's possible. I don't know for sure. And then marijuana, cannabis. There are receptors in your brain, cannabinoid receptors, and cannabis so here. Cannabis is the chemical name for marijuana, and then cannabinoid receptors already exist in the brain. And it's kind of interesting. I don't know why that would be, but they're there. And I don't know much about them, but I do know that obviously there's been some interest in medicinal uses of marijuana. So it can block things like nausea, and they use it sometimes in cancer patients and all. But when you're high, you can get disinhibited, kind of euphoric, and it's interesting with marijuana because some people experience it in a really good way, and other people in a very bad way. And it's I'm sure that it has something to do with the way their brain is wired to start with. So you'll see some folks you'll use and they'll be paranoid as heck, and they'll say, "Man, I don't use that ever again." And other folks, "God, I love that stuff," and they're high, and it feels really good, So it's interesting. That has to be something that's different in the brains of the folks that are using it. It almost has to be, or could be the stuff that they're using, or if it's laced with something, I suppose, is one thing. But these folks, when you're using, I said euphoria, anxiety, and some people paranoia, but poor judgment, attention, slow reaction time. Again, this can interfere with driving or doing a job where you're working on some machine or something. Illusions, hallucinations, increased appetite, call it the munchies, dry mouth, feeling unreal or outside oneself, just sort of like the LSD experience, where that's called like derealization or depersonalization, sort of unreal. Things are unreal, or I'm outside my body watching things from a distance. As far as I know, there's not a huge issue with pure marijuana in an overdose situation. These folks will not usually die. The effect of the drug is just intensified. And the withdrawal is usually also not deadly. It's, these folks can get more anxious and have craving and different things, but it's not typically as bad as some of the others. Sweating, tremor, things like that. I rifled through that awful fast. Does anybody have any other questions for me? Any questions about any of that stuff or the first stuff we talked about at all? Not at all, not a single one. All right, hey. Yes?
So you said with like the monkeys or like with the people that they tested that had the dopamine levels weren't right, and it triggered that little light bulb with the methamphetamines. If you would have kept those same people there and you would have gave them alcohol or gave them cocaine or gave them opiates, would that same light bulb still lit up with that person?
They've done these kind of studies in humans with different, besides just methamphetamine. They've used marijuana, I think. I can't remember which ones they used. And they see the same thing, yes. So the folks that have a low reward center, when you give them alcohol, I think it was alcohol, marijuana, some kind of opiate, and methamphetamine. It seems like cocaine too, so that's quite a few things. Basically what they've come down to is that it doesn't matter whether it's an up or a down or any kind of substance, it's hitting that reward center and it's lighting that part up. If you have an abnormal reward center to start with. But if you don't have an abnormal reward center to start with, these folks say, I could take it or leave it, and it didn't light up the brain as much. Interestingly, if you had a normal reward center, and they gave you, and they did this in that study I was just talking about, they gave these folks IV methamphetamine in pretty big doses, and it was aversive. I mean, oh man, I don't want that ever again. Get that away from me. They experienced it very negatively. So it has a lot to do with how your brain is wired to start with, as to how you experience these different drugs. You know? But it's a good question. Any others? Okay, I think next month I'm going to try to, actually next month I got to move it up a little bit. So it's going to be November 14th, I think. Yeah, Laura and I should communicate a little bit about this. So I think November 14th it'll be still a Tuesday at 7 o'clock, and that's actually a month anyway, but it's not the third Tuesday, it's actually the second Tuesday of November. So keep that in mind, and I'll send out my normal flyer and all that to announce it. But I think, I haven't decided for sure on the topic, but I think what I'm going to do is start where I started in the very, very beginning of all these lectures. And it's really not a disorder I'm going to be talking about it per se, like one particular disorder, but it's about really the neuroplasticity, quote unquote. It's about how we now are learning that our brain is constantly changing every day, all the time in our lives. Okay, and sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that's a bad thing. And so we're going to talk about that, I think, next time. So it's pretty interesting stuff. I mean, stuff that you probably haven't thought about before about your brains. And again, it's kind of cutting edge, scientifically. So, thank you all for coming. It's been a great audience and a nice turnout tonight. I appreciate it. We'll see you.